Of course, this is a continuation video. In part one from Peter van Inwagen on the problem of evil, we looked at the way that the debate was set up. We have an audience of agnostics, completely neutral. We have the atheists debating the theist, and the atheist project is to convince the agnostics that God does not exist, to turn the agnostics into atheists. So the burden is on the atheist in this case, in this argument from evil. In part one, we looked at that, we set up the argument, and we talked about the free will defense. In part two here, we're going to look at further objections, even if one were to grant that free will defense, even if that were successful, what might the atheists say after that? And one objection goes like this: it's the amount of evils in this world, those outweigh the good of free will. There's just too much evil. And this is the kind of discussion that is more common today than a mere defense that alludes to free will. It's an inductive argument, although van Inwagen does not like making that distinction. So the response that van Inwagen has to this concern about the amount of evil is to provide what I call a Genesis story, where you have previously morally good humans, like Adam and Eve, for example, but van Inwagen places these humans in the context of evolutionary history. So at one point, maybe a couple 100,000 years ago, these humans as a group were morally good, but as a result of some choices they made, they became subject to the animalistic tendencies to do evil. So what happened was we have evil introduced, moral evil by the actions of humans, and so that is causing the evil in the world. And for God's response, and van Inwagen is in particular a Christian, so this fits in more clearly with a specifically Christian theology, God set in motion a rescue operation after that occurred. And so the rescue operation is to restore separated humans who are now no longer having fellowship, a union with God, so that the humans would once more be able to love God and cooperate with him. So the idea, though, is that humans have to cooperate with the rescue operation. Somebody who's lost at sea, for example, and the helicopter comes and they dangle down the lifesaver, the human that's being rescued has to reach up, has to grab a hold of it and cooperate with the rescue operation. All kinds of other rescue operations require the cooperation of the humans who are in trouble in order for the operation to succeed. Van Inwagen says this is the same case with God and evil and humans. So some evil needs to remain so that humans would recognize the need for being rescued. If they don't see the need, they're not going to cooperate. If you don't feel like you're in trouble, you're not going to cooperate with someone trying to rescue you. So van Inwagen says that there needs to be some evil that remains, and being separated from God, his term, his phrase here means being among the playthings of chance, being subject to laws of nature and random occurrences that might happen, and suffering as a result of that, so that humans would know they need to be rescued. Now, a response from the atheist at this point might be, are you kidding me? You're appealing to this fanciful myth of Adam and Eve. You're talking about the fall. Now, an atheist, of course, who thinks the existence of God is improbable already thinks this kind of story is vastly improbable and almost certainly false. Okay? That's what the atheist position is. But recall, we're talking about the atheist convincing a neutral agnostic. And Van Inwagen claims, look, the ideal neutral agnostic audience is going to think conditionally. Well, if God exists, if the theist is right, for all I know, this story could be true. And so there is a revised objection, right? So the amount didn't quite work. So maybe we talk about particular evils. So it's not the amount overall, but we focus in on particular horrendous and gratuitous evils, evils that don't seem to bring about any good or prevent any worse harms, and these seem to be especially problematic. Now, Van Inwagen tells a story that he calls the mutilation. It is a horrific story of a woman who's a victim of a horrendous attack. You can read his details if you want. I won't go into it here. But here is the argument. Look, if this horrendous occurrence, this mutilation had not occurred, the world would be no worse than it is, which would seem, of course, clearly true in that case. But the mutilation, in fact, occurred. So how does the argument proceed? The major claim here now is premise 3. If a morally perfect creator could have left out a certain horror of the world he created, and if the world he created would have been no worse if the horror had been left out of it, then if it would have been, if it had included that horror, then the morally perfect creator would have left the horror out of the world he created. Right? If there's something that's absolutely horrible and it looks like the world wouldn't have been worse if that weren't there, right? And why include it, right? The idea is, why let that happen? You're not going to improve the world by letting it be there, so get rid of it, right? Don't let that horrible event occur. And if an omnipotent being created the world, he was able to leave the mutilation out of the world, right? Don't create the kind of world that has that in it. And therefore, there is no omnipotent and morally perfect creator. So that's the force of the argument against this particular kind of evil. How does Van Inwagen respond? Well, he mentions that many theists are going to reject the first premise, question the idea that maybe there might be something better that would happen because of the mutilation, or maybe it would have prevented something worse from happening had the mutilation not occurred. Now, as an example, this is not Van Inwagen, this is me, a Christian, Johnny Erickson, was left a quadriplegic as a teenager due to a diving accident. Now, as an adult, she has influenced maybe millions of people positively with her story. Now, even though she has chronic pain, so she's still a quadriplegic, she still suffers with chronic pain, but she says that this was for good so that she can be an encouragement to so many other people. And so what looked like something that would be a terrible occurrence, a young woman as a teenager being left a quadriplegic, turns out for good. There are many other cases of this. A story from scripture is when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. It looks like a terrible situation. We have later Joseph getting thrown in jail for something he didn't do. But at the end of Genesis, Joseph says that even though other people intended to harm him, it was for good. God had a plan so that his family could be saved by what happened to Joseph. And so a lot of theists tell other stories like that that say, we don't know. Something may look absolutely horrific. It may look like the world would be better without it, but you never know. Okay, that's not Van Inwagen's response. PVI instead denies premise 3, the claim about the morally perfect being wanting to eliminate that if it was gratuitous, if it was unnecessary. And he argues that that moral principle is incorrect. And in order to illustrate why that would be incorrect, he proposes the case of the prison sentence of 10 years, and you have a warden, and in this case, the warden has control over such things. He could reduce the sentence by 1 day. So we imagine a prisoner come to the warden on his second to last day of the term that he's in, and we imagine it's actually 10 years. And he says to the warden, you know, you have this power. Why don't you just let me go today instead of staying around tomorrow? I've already served nearly 10 years. You know, what's it going to benefit anyone if I'm in here suffering another day? Now, it seems like maybe the warden should reduce it. But of course, if he did, why not reduce it to 363 days plus 9 years, right? And then you have the same thing. Any given day, right, going backwards from the 10 years, why wouldn't the warden just reduce it 1 day? Now, the problem is you get clear down to the very first day and the prisoner can say the same thing. Why make me stay in 2 days? Isn't 1 day going to be enough? And then why put me in at all? It's just 1 day. And why put anyone in prison? Now, the problem with that, if you think that some prison terms, any prison terms, are sometimes justified, right? There's vagueness in there on where do you draw the line, right? The principle Van Inwagen claims fails because it forbids drawing arbitrary lines. Wherever you cut off that prisoner's term, it's going to be somewhat arbitrary. There's no absolutely perfect sentence length. But you can't just eliminate it entirely. Having the prison term itself is an overall good. So back to, okay, how much evil do you eliminate, right? There's no clear line. If humans need to cooperate with the rescue mission that God is enacting, then some evil needs to remain. And so it looks like there's simply arbitrary lines left. And maybe, in fact, Van Inwagen points out, it could be that God is acting to prevent many horrors. It's quite possible that all of us had a chance where maybe we were negligent while driving and we almost hit a child, but somehow we missed doing that. And maybe God stepped in these kinds of cases. And all of us may have gone awry horribly at some time in our life or suffered in some significant way, but God stepped in. Maybe God is doing that. It's just that how much he eliminates and how much he allows is arbitrary. So the idea, this question, why doesn't God intervene to reduce or prevent more horrors, right? The amount is too much, right? Wherever he draws the line, it's going to be an arbitrary line. So Van Inwagen says that rebelling against God is like disregarding a clearly worded notice and then going on into a minefield. In separating ourselves from God, rejecting him, we've become the playthings of chance, and that makes us vulnerable to disasters and vulnerable to harms from other people who have free will. If God were to intervene to stop all the horrors, that would have frustrated his plans for restoring human beings to their original union with him. You don't have any horrors, you don't cooperate with a rescue operation, you don't restore yourself with God. So we also sometimes find ourselves in the same or similar situation, right? We are in a situation that God is sometimes. So we can step in and prevent evil. So for example, a parent for a child, how much do you step in? How much do you try to protect your child, right? Do you prevent your child from playing, say, football in the United States, tackle football prone to injuries, right? But then do you let your child play soccer where they often head the ball and that could cause a head injury? Or do you protect your child from playing jump rope because some children have tripped on the rope and then fallen and broken their arm? How much do you step in to prevent these kinds of harms that might occur? How much should we spend as a society to prevent or alleviate various social evils, right? There has to be a limit to the amount that we step in, the amount we prevent, and there's no perfect line on how much to allow and how much to prevent. And so we are often in the same situation as God. So we should not be complaining about God being in this situation. Okay, so a concern now might be natural evil. So there are some evils that are not due to free will. The suffering of animals. Van Inwagen allowed in his story of humans who were morally good, but then somehow used their free will to do evil, that prior to that in evolution, there were millions, literally millions and millions of years of suffering of animals before we even got to that point. So how can you blame that on free will? Now, here's Van Inwagen's defense. And it's a story that is true for all anyone knows. If God exists, this could be true. And what Van Inwagen says is maybe it's the case that every world God could have made that contains higher level sentient beings like us either contains patterns of suffering that is morally equivalent to what we know exist in evolutionary history to those of the actual world. So any other world that would end up with beings like us would have that, or if not, it would be massively irregular. And there are some important intrinsic or extrinsic goods that depends on the existence of higher level sentient creatures. We're worth it, right? Humans are worth it. Beings with free will and the opportunity to love and form loving relationships are worth it. This good is of sufficient magnitude that it outweighs the pattern of suffering found in the actual world. So again, going back to this, well, you could just, why didn't God step in? And, you know, William Rowe tells the story of the fawn. Why doesn't God just save the fawn or kill it instantly so it's not suffering after getting burned in the forest fire? And Van Inwagen's response is to do that constantly would be a massively irregular world. And being massively irregular is a defect in the world. And that defect is at least as great as the defect of continuing patterns of suffering that are morally equivalent to those found in the actual world. For God to be stepping in and intervening constantly, miraculously preventing suffering, you're going to have this massively irregular world, and that's not good. We don't want a massively irregular world. We want to be able to cut down a tree and have it fall, not float off into the sky, for example, like a massively irregular world. So the world, the cosmos, that is the physical universe, has been created by God, and these first three claims are true. That's the story. It seems like that's plausible, and that would explain the existence of natural evil. Now, note that an ages-long series of ubiquitous miracles, right, over millions and millions of years that would cause animal life to be a hedonic utopia where no animal ever suffers. Now, that would have to involve massive irregularity, which is going to be problematic. We can't do science, we can't do our technology, we can't get around in the world if it's massively irregular. Now, again, vagueness is going to be relevant. So if God has some good reason for allowing animals to suffer, there may be no minimum number of cases of intense suffering that God could allow. And if that's the case, any individual case of suffering may not have a particular explanation. So there may not be an explanation of the fawn suffering after being burned by the forest fire and slowly dying in the woods. Maybe it doesn't have an explanation, but there's no minimum number of suffering for God. It has to be arbitrary. Some suffering has to be there, and there's no clear cutoff line. Now, in addition, the suffering of humans is much worse evil than the suffering of other animals. And most people agree with this, and you might call those of us who do agree with this speciesist, but if that's the case, nearly everyone is a speciesist and does think that humans, it's less important, say, that a dog go hungry for a day than that a 3-year-old go hungry for a day. The suffering of humans is a much worse evil. Now, there's no problem with having two different stories, right? Van Inwagen can tell one story for human suffering, a different story for the suffering of animals, and of course, those can be perfectly consistent, so you could just conjoin them and make them one long story, and so it seems like that would make sense. Now, I want to add one other potential response. I've heard this from William Lane Craig suggesting this. Other people have suggested it. Consider blindsight. So there's this problem that some people have where their visual apparatus, their eyes, their optic nerve are functioning fine, and that allows them to navigate around in the world. So if you throw something at such a person, they can see it and they will catch it or block it because they have this ability to see it coming. But the individual experiences the world as a blind person because something else is wrong in the brain and they have no conscious awareness of what they see. Okay, so we know this occurs. Very weird, but we know this happens. It can happen with split brain patients where they are told to draw something that they've only seen with one eye, and they say, well, I didn't see anything, so how can I draw it? And then they're able to draw a car or something like that that was shown, flashed on one side of the screen. Very interesting and weird things going on, but in both cases, the person says they have no experience of seeing it, and yet they've seen it. It affects their behavior. And maybe animals are like that with pain. So there is pain sensations going on. There is this effect that's occurring that we are reasonable to say that an animal is in pain, and yet there's no conscious awareness that I am in pain, right? That it's me that's suffering. So there's a reaction to pain, there's a response. It looks like they are experiencing pain like we do, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's like blindsight. They have no conscious awareness that they themselves are suffering. And so if that's the case, that really affects our view of animal suffering. And this certainly would make it much more clear that human suffering is much worse than the animal suffering that it was ubiquitous prior to the existence of humans on Earth. And so that's another response, another route that people may go, but that's Van Inwagen's response to the problem of evil. In a nutshell, he concludes that the atheist would not succeed in convincing the agnostic to become an atheist.